So the book is, unlike a lot of ethnic studies books, it's not a book about the production of media by a group, and the control of the means of production. It's very much about the opposite. But then also, despite it being the opposite, about media being made by Asians, how did people understand that media? So part of the story begins before the Asian American movement, when we're looking at the beginnings of the Vietnam War occurring. So we officially declare war in '64. And so the early images of the war are coinciding with images of the civil rights movement, and if not exactly coinciding, a couple of years later. And then also the backlash, with the death of Martin Luther King Jr., JFK, that very violent year of the '68, coinciding with the Tet Offensive, which was the year in which people realized, oh shit, we're not going to win this war against these peasants. They're a little bit more advanced than we thought. Having that all come together had people making cheap, some usually not thought through, cheap political analogies. The Viet Cong are among us, and everyone who's against us is a terrorist. All these things. But then also a lot of radical movements thinking, well, this is the beginning of the downfall of the American Empire. We can be part of this. We can take advantage of this. These people who are fighting abroad, they may not be us. And I say that they might not be us because many of these activists, like, for example, Stokely Carmichael, or people, the early Black Panther Party, they were not Vietnamese. And then early Asian American activists, many of them were largely Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino Americans. They were not Vietnamese, but they were seeing brotherhood, or they were seeing similarities. Tanks running through Vietnam, tanks running through Detroit, people shooting at unarmed civilians, outside of Saigon, people shooting at unarmed civilians in a protest in LA or something. So people started thinking about these analogies. So when I talk about a co-rise of movements, a lot of scholars have done this careful social history. And I'm not a careful social historian because I'm not tracing the actual formation of these movements. But I'm talking about how these movements fed off of this media that I think you could very easily categorize as one-dimensional and very exploitative and stereotyping, right? Dead Vietnamese. And of course, there were other Vietnamese that they didn't show, but they liked to show dead Vietnamese. So here, it's not so much that these movements necessarily caused one another. The causation is something historians talk about. But what I do in media studies, and I'm trained in a lot of this sort of high theory, but what I like about it is it talks about these things that aren't quite logical, which is you see these images, they're all mixed up in your brain. They form something like an unconscious. And it's a collective unconscious because you didn't individually see it. It was broadcast on the news for millions of people to see. So now everyone's got this weird mixed up visual unconscious. Tanks, National Guardsmen, soldiers, of all kinds, people being hurt, people being arrested, people being tortured. How does that all feed into then the language that social movements use? So when I say these movements are connected, there are other ways they are connected, literally by organizers and people and events. I'm talking about a more psychic or imaginary connection. Imaginary doesn't mean not real. Imaginary means in the imagination, where they imagine themselves symbolically to be united by certain things happening. And interestingly, because it's imagination, it's not always people, it's taken up by conservatives and right-wing folks as much as leftists. So you have, people like Rambo, the story of Rambo is born in this era. People who are writing about veterans, the white veterans that returns being like the most damaged of all, that suffering the most out of all groups. But what do they use as the language for that suffering? The torture they saw on the news being done to Vietnamese. So it's this interesting thing where the psychic language, the imaginary language, becomes used for all sorts of politics. And so my book was a chance to trace that. And it was a way indirectly for me to think about, well, this is kind of what people are thinking about with Asians just before I came. And it was especially potent to me because my family is, I guess we identify ethnically as Chinese American, but nationally, it's actually very complex. My dad is from Malaysia. My mother is from Taiwan. So there's this Chinese diaspora that includes Vietnam. And my dad served in the military in Malaysia. I don't know what he did. I just have a picture of him with a gun. Um, who knows, fighting counterinsurgency? I have no idea. This is all happening, and it's profoundly changing the notion of Asians as simply a dispensable coolie workforce, which might have been like an earlier 20th century stereotype. Now Asians were subversive and dangerous and revolutionary. Um, and that could go in a lot of different directions. But I think one positive direction it went into was the Asian American movement, which I very much consider myself a product of, even though my parents and I did not participate in, the movement in the 70s.